police arresting protesters near our parliament yesterday at gunpoint. The Wall Street Journal, which is the largest U.S. newspaper, editorialized, the truckers' protest could have been handled without abusing the law. Government's job is to maintain public order while respecting civil liberties. Canada has failed on both scores. The Foreign's press conclusion, our Prime Minister crossed a democratic line. Canadians want the blockade to end, but it never should have come at the expense of the rule of law. Crackdowns, abuse, totalitarian methods in Canada, say Western press. Oh, Canada, that's a deep, deep stain and national embarrassment. Mr. Speaker, I miss my Canada, but some hope. The Wall Street Journal's editorial offers a warning and perhaps a way out, writing, protesters aren't emergencies, and Western leaders had better get used to handling civil disobedience firmly without traducing civil liberties. Mr. Speaker, how should Parliament respond? The only question for us is, does this legislative body support trampling civil disobedience in protest by undermining rights and freedoms? We cannot undo what has happened. Invoking the Emergencies Act is on the Prime Minister and his Liberal cabinet. But we don't need to be culpable. We can stop it. Parliament can act. We must not approve our juvenile Prime Minister's decision in gross misuse of federal law. Parliament can reject the Emergencies Act. It should. Because Canadians, along with the rest of the world, is watching, seeing if we will get it right.
Still a commentaire. Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I actually want to thank the member opposite, because a lot of what I've heard this morning has been very divisive in the name of non-divisiveness. And while I may disagree with much of what was said, I actually appreciate that the tone did not go for that divisive action. What I wanted to speak about, though, and ask, is about the trucking piece, because I do worry about minimizing what we have seen here in Ottawa. And I was speaking to a constituent whose father was delivering produce and was stuck at the U.S. border, vaccinated. He's traveling back and forth, but he was actually stuck because of the protests, unable to get more gas and food for himself while he was on the other side of the border because of what was happening. Does he not agree that, in fact, the majority of truckers were not supporting what we saw in Ottawa? And in fact, what was happening in Ottawa was a disruption, massive disruption to the lives of people who lived in this region.
Honourable Member for New Brunswick Southwest.
Thank you for my honourable colleague's question. And I've attempted to maintain a civil tone throughout these debates. I actually don't know where the majority of truckers are on this question. I certainly know a lot of them are not happy with lockdowns, restrictions, and mandates, even though almost the vast majority of them are vaccinated. I represent a border community. There are 5 international crossings in my riding. I don't think that border points should be blocked, which is why I maintained from the very moment that they had to be cleared out. Having said that, peaceful civil disobedience is an acceptable way to express oneself. We've seen it throughout the ages, and I hope it will continue here in Canada.
A commentaire, questions and comments.
The Honourable Member for La Pointe de l'Île. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could my colleague please tell us more about the impact of passing the Emergencies Act when it is not necessary, as is the case right now? The Honourable Member for New Brunswick Southwest. Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Listen, in my opinion, it has an impact on our reputation as a country. We see right now in Europe, in England, in the United States, and elsewhere, that there are people who are citing Canada as a country that doesn't respect human rights. And I find that shocking, and I find it very regrettable.
A commentaire, questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Nunavut.
I would like to thank the member for New Brunswick Southwest. I have been thoroughly disgusted that the Conservatives keep minimizing the extremism that has allowed to grow in all of Canada. I have seen the effects of these these extremist messages reach my home community of Lulik. It rampaged through the community. For weeks, COVID-19 cases rose. Igloolik is not the largest community in Nunavut, but it had the highest incidence rates for a while. Does the member agree that these extremist views, having infiltrated the farthest reaches of my riding in Nunavut, is an indication that extremism such as this is a national issue requiring urgent action?
Honourable member for New Brunswick Southwest.
Well, I thank the member from Nunavut, and I agree that members or citizens in this country should look to science and vaccines as a way out and a way to protect themselves. But that does not involve invoking the Emergencies Act. And I hope my remarks today have convinced members to at least think about, this is NDP members, to think about their support for the draconian actions that the government has taken and the impact on Canada's reputation. We can't undo it, but Parliament should not sanction what the Liberal government has done.
Reprise du débat, continuing debate, the honourable member for Bay Quinte.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If you plan to fail, you fail to plan. You plan to fail, and that's the deal. From the early stages of the pandemic to now a protest that has become the target of the sledgehammer that is the Emergency Act, when the government has failed in every which way to plan for events that had ample opportunity to be ready for, it is dismally planned to fail. Before COVID-19, we had SARS, which was a precursor to the pandemic that should have given us a roadmap to what could come. It didn't. From a dismal lack of stockpiling of PPE to the complete inadequate healthcare capacity of our whole system, to the failure to be able to produce a single drop of vaccine 2 years in, Mr. Speaker, Canada was not ready for what became the biggest spend of money in all of Canadians' lifetimes combined. But what we will see in the next decade, misspending, which has created the biggest and largest inflation in 30 years, gas prices now over $1.80 in some parts of the country, and grocery bills that are crippling to our families. Government did what government had to do when there was no plan. It intervened. And the problem with government taking total control is it hates to lose the control it has gained. Let's switch gears to the protests here in Ottawa. The convoy drove from west to east, making their way slowly across the country while making it well known that they were not happy with the mandates. Every town they entered, they were met with thousands of Canadians who supported them, feeling hopeful for change. Each Canadian had their own reason for supporting them, but the common thread was the need for change, for hope, and the end to suffering. This government had fair warning. People were coming and were unhappy, and they had ample time to listen to the people and create a plan that Canadians so desperately needed. A roadmap out of this pandemic. But instead of listening and seeing what other countries who had fourth waves ahead of us were doing on January 7th, our health minister said, "I see more mandates coming." Quebec's tax on health and the continued PCR testing that the WHO said was unnecessary. There was and has been no medical scientific data to back up these mandates, just as there was no data to prove that the Prime Minister was correct in suggesting interprovincial passports for truckers was absolutely necessary. So instead of listening and creating a safe, responsible plan, our government took a heavy hand, threatening more mandates and belittling Canadians for expressing their displeasure. Ottawa Police, the RCMP, and Ontario had all the time they needed to prepare for trucks coming downtown, and let's be honest, there was no plan. An article in the National Post on Saturday stated that the Ottawa Police plan was that the trucker protest would last just a weekend. When police were overwhelmed, they still did not announce an emergency. The following week became more indecisive. The police chief actually stated that he believed protester numbers would dissipate on their own. It was a failure to plan. Especially, Mr. Speaker, there was no plan from the federal government to address this larger group, manage any elements of lawlessness, and absolutely no plan to understand that this wasn't just a fringe element, but a larger movement of ordinary Canadians simply looking for hope from somebody, anybody, as we in the world continually reach the last phases of the pandemic and the beginning of an endemic. And it was a larger group who had no affiliation with hate, intolerance, and lawlessness. You only had to listen and speak to many of those screaming to be heard or see the messaging from our constituencies. But most of all, Mr. Speaker, it was a failure by our Prime Minister. You see, we must all remember just one thing in this House: who we work for, whom we represent, and who we answer to. When we forget that, and it feels like the government has forgotten it, we find a divided country. And a divided country allows our country to be weak on the world stage, weak in future planning, and weak to those that look to us for a path forward. The Prime Minister made a choice, and that choice ignored Canadians when they needed a leader to hear from the most. Here are some of the voices from my Bay of Quinte in the last few weeks. Quote, "My son struggles after COVID-19 to the point where he has completely broken down. He can no longer play with friends, and he has no interest in even attending school." Quote, "I had a major reaction to the first vaccine where I cannot mentally get the second and can't get a medical exemption. I'm at the verge of breaking down every day and have never had so little hope." Quote, "I donated $30 to the trucker convoy, not because of any other reason than I wanted hope and an end to the mandates. I'm a single mother and I'm afraid my bank account will be frozen and I will be detained." Quote, "I'm currently a teacher and I'm speaking on behalf of children that are being masked all day long. They cannot breathe. They are not developing social skills with one another that they should be. The language development in several of my senior kindergarten students are being stunted because of the masks." Mr. Speaker, this is after we should be celebrating that what we have done as this country, a country 90% vaccinated, a country that has all the opportunity in front of it for a prosperous future, and a country that can start to heal from its wounds. But Mr. Speaker, as COVID-19 wanes, what is left today is a country in shambles, and the shrapnel remaining is a country divided, leaving generations of mistrust in government. When you divide and conquer, once trust is broken, it is almost near impossible to build it back. Mothers, daughters, sons have contacted us in the last few weeks. There have been massive trauma through COVID-19. Domestic abuse and mental health issues have gone through the roof. The question for the government is this: why is your politics more important than the heart of this nation? We keep creating division when we should be healing. We can't keep fighting across the aisle, slinging mud and acting like it is helpful. Canadians need us to meet them with an open heart, acknowledge their pain, their trauma that they have suffered through this pandemic, and do all we can to be a light after this dark tunnel. It's time to say we are sorry, right our wrongs, and start mending our country and building trust again. The government did what it had to do at the beginning of the pandemic. It intervened because it had no plan. There have been countless consequences of that. And again, with no plan for a prolonged protest downtown Ottawa, is it another scenario with a plan to fail with the Emergency Act? We are against this act. The actions taken this past 3 weeks in several locations in Canada is not an aberration, rather is a manifestation of a growing frustration Canadians have been feeling in our federal government, its inability to truly listen to Canadians and put them ahead of overreach by the government. The invocation of the Emergency Act is a slap in the face to all Canadians and not a proud moment in our country's history. Even if the need for law enforcement is justified, the bailouts who failed to plan, it is the financial overreach that has me most concerned. The law must be predictable and transparent, and the financial overreach of this act isn't. Banks should not and are not our nation's prosecutors. There are laws now that ensure law enforcement can and will go after unlawful activities. But no Canadian who innocently donated to a cause because they wanted desperately to feel hope should feel maligned. And certainly no government looking at powers that allow financial information to be ascertained should be allowed to make those changes permanent as the Deputy Prime Minister made claim to this week. The invocation of the Emergency Act under these circumstances is an insult to all Canadians and certainly not a proud moment of our country's history. Mr. Speaker, our nation needs to start healing now, and that's the one plan that we all need to get behind. Thank you very much.
Question et commentaire, questions and comments. I know the member for Mississauga Erin Mills has been trying to get in a few times. So the member for Mississauga Erin Mills.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I've noticed throughout this morning a very strange, and actually quite over the past couple of years, a very targeted approach, a very divisive approach to really get to this government, and not on any merit. So I ask the member, why is he blurring jurisdiction lines? And I know that we've heard from Bloc Québécois members about the importance of jurisdiction. We've heard from other members about the importance of ensuring that the rule of law, our Constitution, are maintained, and our Constitution accounts for those jurisdictional lines. And as part of their main arguments, we've heard members ask about, how our federal government has failed because of lack of action by regional or provincial governments. So can the member please, really clarify his position there?
The honourable member for Bay of Quinte.
And thank you, the honourable member, for her question. Through you, Mr. Speaker, this was a failure of the government because it starts at the top. We've heard this government, the other side, blame every single party for this, but it starts with, as I've stated, the tone, the escalation, not treating Canadians as Canadians and pitting Canadian versus Canadian. And of course, we talked about the failure of the police here in Ottawa to take care of a situation. I just said that in my whole speech, but it was also the tone by the government to not recognize what was happening to listen to Canadians and ensure, as I've stated, we start healing this nation, not dividing it. Thank you very much.
Question et commentaire, questions and comments.
The honourable member for Thérèse de Blainville. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to ask my Conservative colleague if he agrees with me on 2 points. And he doesn't have to be, though, if he doesn't want to. The first is that I've seen, especially since yesterday, that the only arguments that the Liberals, that the government are giving us are two. That they have a poll of some 340 people who say that Quebecers agree, and the other is that the City of Ottawa said that, well, it's a good thing we had the Emergencies Act. Why, in your opinion, are they minimizing the scope of this act? And through you, Mr. Speaker, why does in my colleague's opinion, Monday, tomorrow, how can they justify telling us to pass this Emergencies Act? The honourable member for Bay of Quinte.
Honourable colleague from Quebec for her question, and we agree. You talked about 2 points. Well, when we've talked about 2 points this week, we're looking for point 1 and point 2 of what the government did before invoking the Emergency Act, because we can't seem to get that answer either. There is no justification for it when we haven't had step 1, 2, or 3 introduced before we had this. And at the end of the day, we agree that this is a step too far, especially as I mentioned with the financial ramifications to Canadians, and especially when the government wants to see some of these changes permanent, which we certainly don't agree with, and as I've stated, is definitely overreached by this government. Thank you.
Question et commentaire, questions and comments. The honourable member for London Fanshawe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his speech. He spoke a lot about healing and mending offenses, but my concern through a lot of this is, of course, that ultra-right-wing, white supremacist organization that is central to a lot of what we have seen over the last 3 weeks here in Ottawa and across this country. So to associate, as some of the members across have, with people like Pat King, who have talked about the depopulation of the Caucasian race and suggesting that the only way the convoy to Ottawa would be solved is with bullets. Can you comment on the dangers of that and the fact that the government has to respond to that in an extremely serious and decisive manner?
The honourable member for Bay of Quinte.
Thank you very much. And I'm happy to address this, and thank the honourable colleague for her question. We've condemned this from the onset. We've condemned this from every single day as MPs, as Canadians. You know, at the end of the day, this was not what this protest was, the movement by the government. This was what this was about. These are Canadians. When we're listening to our constituency offices and I get calls and emails as a member of Parliament, the majority of Canadians, Mr. Speaker, wanted hope, and they wanted to end division, and they wanted to end mandates. This element that exists in Canadian society, all of us as MPs strongly condemn that. I want to make that very clear. Have zero association to it, and all members in this House, all of us represent Canadians all across this country, condemn hate, condemn violence, and condemn intolerance, and let's make sure that's the way we go forward from here on in.
Returning to debate, resuming debate, the honourable member for Foothills.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My heart aches to be in the House speaking on this today. And I want to echo some words from my constituents. I know many of us in this room have had thousands of emails and phone calls from our constituents. Just a couple of quotes from some of those emails and phone calls. Never did I think I would see this in my country. I don't recognize our Canada right now. Our anthem has lost all meaning this week. Let's remember our anthem. True patriot love in all of us command. True north, strong and free. That is what our anthem stands for. And when Canadians are telling me and my constituents that they think our anthem has lost all meaning by the actions over the last several weeks, that is disheartening. But they're sending these emails because there is a crisis in this country. But the crisis isn't what the Prime Minister is depicting that it is. The crisis is a lack of trust from Canadians for their Liberal government and for the Prime Minister. That is the crisis we are facing. When citizens come to Ottawa, the seat of our national government, what they expect is to be heard, to be respected. Instead, the Prime Minister vilified, mocked, and stigmatized. Let's take a look at what the Prime Minister preaches and what he practices. He preaches diversity is our strength. A Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian. We've got your back. But what we have seen is what the Prime Minister practices. You're racist, misogynist, the fringe, unacceptable. This is not the actions of a leader. These are the actions of a schoolyard bully. And that is exactly how our Prime Minister has acted. Now, the Prime Minister said invoking the Emergencies Act was the last possible step he would take. It wasn't the first, wasn't the second, wasn't the third. But what was 1, 2, and 3? None of us have seen that. It clearly states in the Emergency Act to invoke this legislation, you must table a document that outlines who you've spoken with. Groups, organizations, people, before you press the nuclear option. But did he speak to anyone? Did he go outside and meet with the protesters? No. Did anyone speak on anyone outside his bubble before he pressed this nuclear option? No. What the Prime Minister did was hide in his cottage. When Canadians wanted hope, they needed leadership, he abandoned them. He neglected his duty. The Prime Minister led us into this crisis. He had no intentions of ending the mandates. He wanted no path forward for united Canada. No, instead, every time he doubled down. He threatened to increase restrictions, vilified millions of Canadians, further stoking fear and division. Well, Mr. Prime Minister, through you, Speaker, mission accomplished. Here we are as a country divided and fallen. This was not a national emergency. This wasn't a security issue. This was a political emergency brought on by the Prime Minister. And it was a political emergency because you know what happened? Over the last few weeks, Canadians found their voice. They found their voice to stand up for what they believe in. They found their voice to push back against a bully, vaccinated and unvaccinated. They found their voice to say, I want my job back. I want my family back. I want my life back. And when the Prime Minister saw Canadians standing up, he pressed the panic button. And that panic button was the Emergencies Act. And here I want to be very, very clear. The ramifications of invoking the Emergency Act are profound. That's because it's never been done before. When we had 9/11, the Oka crisis, during the height of this pandemic, no government ever talked about invoking the Emergencies Act. 2 years ago, when anti-energy activists had blocked highways, railways, ports, the government under this Prime Minister never talked about the Emergencies Act. And those protests lasted for 17 days and actually brought our entire economy to its knees as zero trade was happening. Did they think about the Emergency Act? No. Meanwhile, over the last week, these blockades that the Prime Minister is saying are devastating our economy in Coutts, Ambassador Bridge, Emerson, have all been resolved. And they didn't take the Emergencies Act. They were resolved because the police services in those areas used the tools that were available to them under the criminal code, existing tools. There's no need for the Emergency Act to resolve these blockades. Or, in many cases, people just went there and listened. Did the Prime Minister do that? He has refused to do that. Myself and several of my colleagues, we went to Coutts, spent hours with the organizers, talking to them. And you know what they said? They just wanted to be heard. That's what they were asking for. And they felt they were heard because we went there, reached out to them, had a conversation with them. And they started to make that decision to start pulling out. Because these are just families. These are just families from across Alberta, in my case, in Coutts, who are frustrated. They're angry because no one was listening to them. And you know what happened at the end of that when they pulled off from the blockade? You can see it on YouTube. You can see it on video. They stood hand in hand with the police officers and sang "O Canada." In many cases, hugged one another and shook hands. That's what happens when you don't use a sledgehammer. So what is the threat to national security? These blockades are removed. What is the justification of invoking the Emergencies Act? In a simple answer, there isn't one. In fact, a prominent lawyer in my riding, he sent me a note and he said, there was never a point with regard to any alleged blockade that could not have been resolved under the existing Canadian law that would justify the invocation of the Emergencies Act. And then yesterday, in a scathing editorial, the Wall Street Journal stated, and I quote, in abusing these powers in a non-emergency, the Prime Minister has crossed a democratic line. Well, I would argue the Prime Minister wants to erase that line entirely. The Liberal Finance Minister has already said that some of the powers that they've invoked as a part of the Emergency Act, she wants to make permanent. So, was invoking the Emergencies Act, which we all now know is unwarranted and unjustified, was this actually the end game, to simply make portions of this power grab permanent? Was that their goal all along? Will the Liberals ban protests that don't align with their ideology? Will they retain access over the Canadian savings accounts? They are saying that these powers are geographically targeted. We know that's not true. The financial implications of this and freezing bank accounts, that impacts every single Canadian. It's not geographically targeted. I have no words for this type of audacity. And unfortunately, this is real. It's not happening. It's happening in Canada, not Moscow, not North Korea, not Cuba, right here. Mr. Speaker, I want to finish with this. I received a call in my office from a single mother in my riding. She donated $20 to the Convoy because she felt this was something that was important. She wanted an end to the mandates. $20. Since the Liberals have invoked the Emergency Act, they have threatened to freeze accounts of anybody who supported this convoy or these protests. In fact, the Minister of Justice, when asked what was going to be the metrics on whose accounts were going to be frozen, he couldn't answer, or he wouldn't answer. Instead, he compared anyone who supported these protests to terrorists. Is this mom a terrorist? Is she a racist? No, this mom is terrified. She's terrified she's going to get her accounts frozen, unable to feed her kids, maybe miss a mortgage payment and lose her home. This is who this mom is. Of course, she's not a terrorist, but this is the fear-mongering and the threats that are happening. This is a sad day in our country, Mr. Speaker. It is incumbent on all of us in this House, to defend the civil liberties when a governing party so callously and blatantly wants to travel over them. I look at the bricks in this House that were built on a strong foundation of democracy, freedom, and a strong, united country. This government is taking a sledgehammer to those foundational bricks of our democracy. We cannot and we must not let that happen.
Question et commentaires, questions and comments. L'honorable député de
The honourable member for Notre Dame de Grâce. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
He said that all the truckers at Coots wanted was to be heard. I'd like him to comment on the fact that an arms cache was found at Coots.
The honourable member for Foothills.
Yeah, I'm glad the honourable member raised that. And I know the Liberals want to paint every single Canadian with the same brush, or every single person who is part of that. But I will tell you, I was on the phone for hours on Monday, as were many of my colleagues, with the organizers of the Coots. When they found out that a different group, a militant group, had made their way into the protest, they wanted nothing to do with it, and they immediately stood down and brought down the blockade. They were not associated with that group, and it's shameful that the Liberals are trying to paint this group as having, with every other protester that is out there, that these are exactly who everyone was, because they know that's not true.
That's not what everybody wanted, just some.
Question et commentaires, questions and comments. L'honorable député.
The honourable member for Avignon La Métis Matane. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. And ironically, this morning, I had a notification from Instagram that reminded me what happened 2 years ago. And to this day, there was a train blockade. One moment. There are two conversations happening at the same time, so I cannot hear the question from the member.
Point of order. The honourable member for the honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member from St. Albert has referred to me as a despicable human being. I'm pretty sure that that's not parliamentary language. I would ask that you ask him to withdraw those comments, please.
I did hear it as well, and I did see the exchange that was happening there. I did hear the member, so I was wondering if the member would want to maybe retract that. I'm looking at the member who did say it. The honourable member for St. Albert Edmonton.
Mr. Speaker, that honourable member claimed that I was taking a photo with swastikas, and that is an
Point of order. The honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker. Our parliamentary rules say that you cannot call an individual names. Again, this member called me a despicable human being. He has the request under our procedural order to apologize and withdraw that comment. I would ask you.
Order. Okay. The honourable member for Sandwich Gulf Islands. On this point of order.
I lament that we are here on a Sunday morning when on a normal Sunday at 9:15 I'd be in church, and this is the opposite of any place I've ever worshipped right now. The air is toxic, and it's certainly, Mr. Speaker, it's for you to rule it. I just wanted you to know that all of us in this corner heard the member from St. Albert say distinctly and clearly, you are a despicable human being. And I think he would want, reflecting on where he usually is on a Sunday morning, to, in his own heart, decide to withdraw those remarks as completely inappropriate.
The honourable member for St. Albert Edmonton.
Moving forward with debate, I'll withdraw.
There you go. I'll take a deep breath. I know it's early, and I agree with the member for Sandwich Gulf Islands. Normally we'd be doing something different this morning, and I know we've already been at it for 3 days now. We've got today and tomorrow to still go to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to speak to this important bill.
The honourable member for Avignon Matin, please start your question again. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. People are getting heated, but I'd like to change my question, but I'd like us to focus on the debate. We're talking about the Emergencies Act that has never been invoked, and there's a reason for that. We could have used other tools before we got to this, and I go back to my original question. 2 years ago, to this day, the Wet'suwet'en were protesting for their gas line, and the RCMP was sent in rather quickly. And there was a court decision. So clearly there was other tools that could have been used. We didn't need the Emergencies Act. What does my colleague think of that?
Member for Foothills.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my colleague for that question. And she's exactly right, which I think is the impetus of many of the speeches over this weekend and probably going into tomorrow is there are other tools that law enforcement has in their toolbox that would have addressed all of this. And it addressed the illegal blockades at the borders previously to the Emergency Act, but certainly to that specific case 2 years ago. That was where protesters were blocking critical infrastructure across this country for more than 17 days. And the Liberals put out every minister possible to talk to those folks. They sent out the RCMP to dismantle those things. Did they do any of that this time? Did a single member of the Liberal Party go out across the street and speak to a protester and hear what their concerns were? Well, did a single one? I don't think so.
Questions and comments. Question et commentaire. The honourable member for Hamilton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member completely failed to address the previous important question posed. He painted a picture of Coots only being about holding hands and singing "O Canada." This honourable member's denialism of what happened at Coots is completely in line with his party's ongoing denialism of the extremist white supremacist threat to our Canadian democracy. 13 people have been charged with conspiracy to commit murder after finding firearms and a cache of ammunitions. Why does this honourable member continue to downplay the clear and present threat to highly organized and violent elements within this extremist movement by wrapping it in a Canadian flag?
The honourable member for Foothills.
Well, I love the fact that the NDP is trying to paint themselves out of a corner that they've put themselves in by supporting the Emergencies Act, something that this party was founded on, protecting the civil liberties of Canadians. So they are going against the very foundation of their party by trying to make this whole issue about white supremacy. My constituents who live around Coots and were down there are certainly not armed thugs and white supremacists. Did a group infiltrate that movement? Absolutely. Did they do everything they possibly could to purge it? Absolutely. This is a ridiculous argument by the NDP trying to defend their indefensible, which is supporting the Emergencies Act.
Question et commentaire, questions and comments. The honourable member for Mississauga Erin Mills on a quick answer question there.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll be very, very quick. I know the member had said, has any one of us on the other side talked to any of the protesters? Well, one of my constituents, when she came back from Ottawa, I did speak with her and we had a very, very good conversation. I asked the member, is it okay, according to his speech, that a couple of hundred people can go and take over a city that inhabits tens and thousands of people and to terrorize them, make their lives inconvenient, to harass their movement? Does he think that those hundreds speak for all of those tens of thousands?
Honourable member for Foothills, and a short answer.
Well, I'm really happy how she asked that question. Does she think that a few bad apples in a group speak for everyone? Did that constituent that she met, that was her constituent, was that constituent a racist, a misogynist, the fringe, unacceptable, taking up space? I'd like to know what her perspective on her own constituent was.
Resuming debate, reprise du débat, the honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And as always, it is a deep honour to stand in this place and represent the people of Edmonton Strathcona. Today, we gather to debate the enactment and bringing forward of the Emergency Act. It's the enactment of legislation that has never been used before. And I deeply feel the gravity and the responsibility of the work that we are doing in this place. I recognize the serious situation that we as parliamentarians, indeed we as Canadians, find ourselves at this pivotal time. I hope that every member in this place has spent time over the past several weeks thinking about our roles as leaders in this country and the responsibilities we have to make difficult decisions for the benefit of our constituents and for the benefit of Canada. But before I share my thoughts on the implementation of the Emergency Act, I want to take a moment, Mr. Speaker, if I can, to acknowledge the staff, the security working on the Hill today. I want to thank all of those who have had to walk across a blockade to get to work. I want to thank all of those who are not spending the family day-long weekend with their families because they are helping us in the House today. And the pages, my colleague has reminded me. And I want to thank the law enforcement officers as well. Mr. Speaker, I walked home from this place last night in the dark, protected by the police officers that held the line so that I could get to my apartment in Centretown. The police that have put themselves at risk today and for the last several days to make our city safe again for people in Ottawa, I want to thank them. And finally, I want to thank the journalists, Mr. Speaker, who in frigid temperatures for days on end have brought information to Canadians. They have been sworn at, they have been spat at, they have been assaulted, they have been threatened, and they have stood on the streets of Ottawa to tell this story every day. And that is a cornerstone of our democracy. And every Canadian should be thankful that we have members of an independent media that will tell the story and that will share the information that needs to be shared with Canadians. Mr. Speaker, where we find ourselves as a nation is heartbreaking. What we have collectively witnessed over the past 3 weeks makes it crystal clear just how crucial it is that we do what we can to restore order in our country, to clear our borders of blockades and the illegal siege of Ottawa and the threats and intimidation directed at those who live and work here. And Mr. Speaker, more importantly, as parliamentarians, we need to make sure that this cannot happen again. I want to be very clear. I am not happy with where we find ourselves. I am angry that our country has come to this. The deep failures of our municipal and provincial governments, and yes, the failures of our federal government, have put us in a position where we are required to use extraordinary actions to go forward. Mr. Speaker, today and every day, I use my voice, I use my role in this place, in this chamber, to fix issues that have led to the use of the Emergency Act. I will use my role so that it never has to be used again. Mr. Speaker, we need to take a close look at policing in this country. We have seen obvious, systematic racism across the police force on an almost daily basis. There are far too many examples of unnecessary and excessive uses of force directed at Black, Indigenous, and racialized individuals, against the unhoused and others who are living in poverty. We have seen vicious attacks on these individuals' bodies and belongings. And yet we know that the RCMP can exhibit incredible care and restraint. We have seen it. We saw it demonstrated in Ottawa, in Windsor, in Emerson, and in Coutts. We saw incredible restraint and a refusal to act from our police forces playing out, not over minutes and hours, but over days and weeks. As I stand in this place, I want us all to try to imagine how it must feel to be an Indigenous land defender and watch white blockade members in Coutts, Alberta, hug the RCMP. I want us to think about how it must feel to be an unhoused person in Toronto who is been brutalized by police. Watch the Ottawa police employ unbelievable gentleness with the illegal occupation in Ottawa. You know, in Alberta, we have a law. We have a law that I deeply dislike. It was the very first law that was put in place under Premier Kenney. Bill 1, his first legislation. And it was so that blockades could not stop our major infrastructure. It was to protect our major infrastructure from being clogged up. But Mr. Speaker, that law hasn't been enacted. And if we ever needed something that proved to us that Bill 1 was never intended to be used against white people, it was never intended to be used against the Premier's friends, this is proof. That legislation was put in place to hurt Indigenous people. It was put in place to stop environmentalists. It was never intended to be used against Jason Kenney's friends who have shown who they are, who have shown that they are white supremacists, that have shown that they have attempted murder. This is an armed insurrection on the border in our country, and the legislation was not used. We also need to fully examine and strengthen our federal hate crime legislation to make sure that it can address the white supremacist and neo-Nazi extremism that is threatening our society. I was happy to second my dear friend, the member for New Westminster Burnaby's bill to ban symbols of hate.
No offense, but man, she sounds like some freaking SGW chick that won't stop babbling about race this, race this. Stupid.
But we can't only ban the symbols of hate. We must counter the radicalization of Canadians that is happening online and over our public airwaves. Like the trash radio, Mr. Speaker, that radicalized the man who killed 6 worshippers at the Quebec City Mosque.
That was my opinion, but
like the online
I'll keep this stream going.
That radicalized one of the men arrested in Coutts, Alberta, who was accused of participating in a plot to murder an RCMP officer. According to his father, this man was radicalized online by a far-right extremist group known as Diaglon, a group that seeks to overthrow our government through violence. The Liberal government has promised to table legislation to stop online hate, and they have failed, as of yet, to act on that. In fact, we see misinformation on our radio waves. We see Russian misinformation happening with CRTC licensing. This is something that we can and need to fix now. We have to review and update our money laundering laws to combat the funding mechanisms that fund hate groups and that hate groups use to bankroll their activities. We need ongoing measures to prevent the funding of hate groups, not Emergency Act legislation. We need ongoing support for that. And Mr. Speaker, as my friend, the member for Hamilton Centre said yesterday, none of this is new. None of this is things that we haven't heard before. We've known that these are things that have to be fixed, and we haven't done it. And we find ourselves in an emergency situation because those steps have not been taken. Mr. Speaker, COVID has been incredibly hard for all of us. We have all had to deal with the lockdowns, the restrictions, the protections put in place for years. It's been a challenge. Mr. Speaker, I'm a mother. I've watched my children be challenged. I've watched the things that they have missed. I'm a daughter. I have parents who are elderly that I worry about every day. I've seen people in our community lose loved ones. I've seen them lose livelihoods. I've seen the impacts of the opioid addiction crisis, the unsafe drug supply crisis in my province. But we don't end pandemics with illegal blockades. We don't end pandemics with sieges and occupations. Mr. Speaker, viruses don't care if we're done with them. They are not done with us. That's not how it works. The only way to end public health, to end a pandemic, is through public health measures. Public health measures, Mr. Speaker, that are based on science. If we allow bullies to intimidate us out of protecting the public health, as we've seen in Alberta, we are surrendering to injustice. We are allowing those with the strongest voices, the largest vehicles, the loudest horns to rule. We are capitulating to mob rule, and we are sacrificing our democracy and our own values. The speaker before me made it sound like this is not what's happening in Alberta, but we're seeing the worst of it in Alberta. 13 armed men are directing our public health policy in Alberta. Think about that for a moment, please, Mr. Speaker. Now, today we are debating the Emergency Act to deal with illegal activities that the province and the police forces have not had the will to address. But this government must also address the underlying cause of the alienation that many people feel in our country. Over the past 2 decades, we have seen the wealth and well-being of ordinary Canadians decline. While wealth and power has accumulated to the top 1% in our country, the billionaire class. Mr. Speaker, costs continue to rise. Electricity and heating costs, grocery costs, housing costs, these are all rising while incomes are staying stagnant. The urge to lower taxes that has obsessed our governments over the past 20 years may on the surface look like a solution. But upon closer examination, it actually contributed to the problems that we are facing. Taxes for the wealthy and corporations have been slashed dramatically, while the tax burden has shifted to low and middle income countries. Low and middle income Canadians, sorry, Mr. Speaker. It's not fair, and it's not working. We have a housing crisis in this country. We have an opioid poisoning crisis in this country. 1 in 10 Canadians live in poverty. More than half of those are seniors. And we have more Canadians working more hours with less job security than we have seen since the 1970s, Mr. Speaker. This is not a sustainable plan. This is not a sustainable way for our country to go forward. Because then, when a crisis comes along, when a global pandemic that threatens the lives and the livelihoods of nearly every Canadian, we should not be surprised that some Canadians start to feel alienated, that they feel left out. We should not be surprised that they turn to false prophets and misinformation, that they turn on those that govern. In the just over 2 years that I've been sitting as a member in this House, we have worked together through this pandemic. That's true. But we have not worked together to address the underlying issues, the root causes of the alienation and dissatisfaction that so many Canadians feel now. The sense of hopelessness that pervades. We don't know when this pandemic will end. No one in this House knows when this pandemic will end. We don't know how many times the virus will mutate. We don't know how many variants still await us, how many waves we may face. Yet this government's been so anxious to cancel COVID support programs and so hesitant to address the underlying economic and social issues problems that the pandemic has laid bare and that have led to the sense of hopelessness so many Canadians feel. We have so much work to do here, together, to create a better, fairer, and more just Canada. Mr. Speaker, we know why we are here today. Ottawa has been under siege. Our borders have been blockaded. Our democracy has been threatened. And we have witnessed some of the greatest failures of leadership our country has ever seen. Where was the coordination between the federal government, the province, and the City of Ottawa? Why did it take so long for the Prime Minister to act? So-called leaders like Doug Ford and Jason Kenney have completely failed their provinces. They have failed to act, they have failed to lead, and they have failed to protect their citizens. They have failed to protect jobs in the economy. They have failed to protect healthcare workers. They have failed to even address the racism and violence that undermines our democracy. Mr. Speaker, a government member of the Legislative Assembly of Alberta in my province joined the illegal blockade at Coots. Another Conservative MLA in Alberta actually urged police officers not to follow the orders of their superiors. They have encouraged lawlessness. They've taken selfies with extremist leaders. Imagine what it feels like to be a radicalized Canadian, to see the Conservative Member of Parliament from Cypress Hills Grasslands posing with Pat King, proclaiming his support for Pat King, the notorious leader of the Convoy, the famous racist, the anti-Semitic, Islamic-phobic Pat King, who told us this thing would not end until bullets start flying. Imagine what it feels like to live and work in Ottawa, to have not been able to go to your job, to not be able to actually make an income, and to see the MP from Carleton handing out coffee and donuts to those that torment you. Canadians have had enough of Conservatives playing footsie with radical extremists, with racists like Pat King, and violent hate organizations like Daglon. Canadians are fed up with the mob mentality of the Conservatives, and I would ask that the Conservatives apologize in this House. I accept the profound responsibility, Mr. Speaker, that the Emergency Act entails. I will do everything I can, alongside my colleagues here in this House, to ensure that this government does not abuse the powers granted to it by this Act. We and other parties in the House have the power to stop the emergency declaration should that become necessary. We will not hesitate to use that power if the government exceeds the authority necessary to deal with this emergency. To finish, Mr. Speaker, my Canada is filled with kind, caring, intelligent people who care for their community. My Canada has frontline workers, doctors and nurses and healthcare workers who have literally risked their lives for years to protect us. My Canada has teachers who have worked